The tow truck lifted my medical transport at 6:18 in the morning. Chains snapped tight under the rear frame, amber lights flashed across my bedroom window, and Diane Holloway stood in my driveway, holding an HOA violation notice like a victory flag. The van was not abandoned. It was not commercial storage. It was my registered medical transport, parked on my property, with disability permits and hospital paperwork visible on the dashboard. Across the street, neighbors watched through half-open blinds because this was no longer about parking. That van controlled my access to treatment, appointments, and basic mobility. Diane had just touched the one system I could not simply replace. The diesel engine rattled hard enough to shake the cold air. I stepped onto the porch barefoot, one hand gripping the railing, the other reaching for the folder I kept beside the door. The morning smelled like wet asphalt, exhaust, and lawn chemicals from the common area sprinklers. The tow operator avoided my eyes. That told me plenty. Diane did not. She wore a gray coat, pearl earrings, and that polished HOA smile people use when they want cruelty to look administrative. "Mr. Walker," she said, loud enough for the neighbors to hear, "this vehicle violates community appearance standards." I pointed to the windshield. "The medical placard is right there." She barely glanced at it. "This community has rules." The winch pulled again. Metal groaned softly. My van shifted backward another foot. That sound went straight through my chest. I am Ethan Walker, 44 years old, a former emergency medical technician, and after a spinal injury ended my field career, that van became my independence. It carried my mobility lift, my medical equipment, my appointment files, my backup oxygen case. Not because I wanted sympathy, because life works better when essential systems are ready before you need them. Diane saw a vehicle she disliked. I saw the difference between keeping a medical appointment and missing one. The tow operator finally looked at me. His jaw tightened. "Sir, I am just following the authorization." He handed me a copy of the tow order. The paper was damp from the morning. Fog. HOA request. Immediate removal. Repeat violation. Diane Holloway's signature sat near the bottom. Under reason for removal, somebody had typed unauthorized commercial vehicle. I read that line twice. The van had no business logo, no commercial plates, no advertising, just a wheelchair access decal and medical transport registration. Behind Diane, Brian Keller from the compliance committee stood beside his white SUV with his phone out. He was not recording the tow truck. He was recording me. That was the first crack in their story. People documenting a reaction usually know they created one. I took a slow breath and stepped off the porch. My knees felt stiff in the cold. The lift controls were still inside the van. So was the appointment packet for my treatment center at 9:30. Diane watched me move toward the driveway and raised one hand. "Please do not interfere with enforcement." Enforcement. That word hung in the air like smoke. The tow truck started forward. My front tires rolled over the damp pavement, leaving dark tracks where the van had rested. Mrs. Callahan across the street opened her front door. Kevin Ramirez stepped onto his porch 2 houses down. No one spoke. The truck turned toward the subdivision exit, taking my medical transport with it. Diane slid the violation notice against my garage door with one neat strip of blue painter's tape. Then she adjusted her coat and walked back toward her SUV. I looked at the empty space in my driveway. A small oil stain remained where the van had been parked. The silence after the engine faded felt heavier than the noise. Then my phone buzzed with a reminder from the clinic. I stared at the clinic reminder on my phone while the empty space in my driveway seemed to grow larger by the second. The screen showed 9:30 in the morning. My appointment was less than 3 hours away. The cool air carried the smell of damp grass and diesel that still lingered after the truck left. I walked back inside and set the violation notice on the kitchen counter. Water dripped from my shoes onto the tile. The house felt unusually quiet. A few seconds later, my phone rang. It was the clinic. The receptionist sounded polite but concerned. She asked if I was still coming. I told her what had happened. Silence filled the line for a moment. Then she asked if I could find another ride. That was the problem. The van was not just transportation. It was designed around equipment I depended on. There was no quick replacement. I promised I would try. After the call ended, I opened my laptop. Another surprise was waiting. An email from the HOA had arrived less than 10 minutes after the tow truck left. The timestamp caught my attention immediately. Attached was a notice claiming this was not the first violation. I frowned. I had never received any previous warning. That detail mattered. I checked my inbox history. Nothing. I checked my spam folder. Nothing there either. A second email arrived while I was searching. Then a third. Each one sounded more aggressive than the last. It felt coordinated. Outside, a lawn maintenance crew started mowing the common area. The sound of engines drifted through the windows. I grabbed my folder and drove to the towing company in a rideshare vehicle. The warehouse sat on the edge of town behind a chain-link fence. Sunlight reflected off rows of impounded vehicles. My van stood near the back lot. Seeing it there tightened something in my chest. The employee at the front desk handed me a release sheet. I scanned the numbers. Storage fees had already started accumulating. More importantly, the paperwork listed the reason for removal exactly as it appeared on Diane's order. Unauthorized commercial vehicle. I asked the employee if they verified classifications before towing. He shook his head. They relied on the requesting authority. Another small detail. Another piece of the puzzle. As I left the office, an older man loading supplies into his truck stopped me. He recognized the van. He lived in my neighborhood. His expression shifted when I explained what happened. "That is not the first time," he said quietly. He looked around before continuing. According to him, several residents had received violations that later disappeared without explanation. Some challenged them. Others simply paid. The pattern sounded familiar. Before I could ask more, he handed me a business card and told me to call later. Then he drove away. Back at home, I found another envelope taped to my garage door. The tape was identical to the strip Diane used earlier. Inside was notice of a compliance hearing scheduled for the following week. The speed of it felt unusual. They had already removed the vehicle. Now they wanted a hearing too. The afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the driveway. Across the street, Mrs. Callahan stepped outside carrying a grocery bag. She hesitated, then walked toward me. The look on her face told me she had something important to say. She glanced toward Diane's house before lowering her voice. "You are not the only one she has done this to." Mrs. Callahan glanced over her shoulder before speaking again. The late afternoon sun reflected off her glasses. A lawn sprinkler clicked steadily somewhere down the block. 3 years ago, she targeted my son, she said. Not like this, but close. Her voice stayed low. She explained how violation notices had appeared without warning. Then fines followed. Then pressure. The details were different, but the pattern felt familiar. A few minutes later, she handed me copies of old emails she had saved. The paper smelled faintly of dust and printer ink. One sentence caught my attention immediately. Diane had used nearly identical language years earlier. That was not coincidence. That was habit. Another neighbor joined us before long. Then another. The small gathering near my driveway grew quietly. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody seemed eager to become involved. Yet each person carried a story. One had received citations for a trailer that was never there. Another had been warned about landscaping already approved by the board. Piece by piece, a picture emerged. Diane did not simply enforce rules. She seemed to choose targets. A cool breeze pushed leaves across the sidewalk. The neighborhood looked peaceful from a distance. Up close, the mood felt different. People washed windows before speaking. They lowered their voices when mentioning board members. That detail stayed with me. Communities do not act like that without a reason. As evening approached, I carried the documents inside and spread everything across my dining room table. The overhead light cast long shadows across the paperwork. Violation notices, HOA emails, tow records, hearing notices. I lined them up by date. Patterns became easier to spot. Several notices shared the same wording. Some referenced rules that appeared nowhere in the community handbook. Others contained dates that did not make sense. One timestamp especially stood out. An email warning me about repeat violations had been created before the alleged first warning ever reached me. I checked it twice, then a third time. The sequence was impossible. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. It was Kevin Ramirez. He stood on my porch holding a flash drive. His expression looked serious. "You should probably see this," he said. We sat at the kitchen table while I opened the files. Security footage from his doorbell camera filled the screen. The video showed my driveway 2 nights before the tow. Diane and Brian walked past my property after dark. They stopped near the curb. Brian pointed toward my van. They spoke for several minutes. No audio existed, but the conversation appeared deliberate. Then they walked away. Kevin leaned back in his chair. I thought it looked strange at the time. The room fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. That footage changed things. It suggested planning. It suggested intent. More importantly, it suggested the decision happened before any violation process supposedly began. Outside, darkness settled over the neighborhood. Porch lights flickered on one by one. I saved copies of everything on multiple drives. Then I photographed every document with my phone. Experience had taught me something important years earlier. Information disappears when pressure arrives. Around 9 o'clock, another email from the HOA landed in my inbox. The subject line mentioned the upcoming compliance hearing. Attached was a packet nearly 40 pages long. I opened it slowly. The first page carried Diane's name. The second carried Brian's. Then I noticed a statement that made my stomach tighten. According to their filing, my vehicle had created a continuing threat to community standards for months. That claim was not merely exaggerated. It was impossible to support. Someone had decided facts were optional. Then I reached the final attachment. The final attachment opened with a list of photographs. I clicked the first image, then the second, then the third. The room felt colder with each one. Every photograph showed my van parked legally in my driveway. The timestamps stretched back nearly 6 months. Someone had been documenting it for a long time. The images were labeled as evidence. Yet none showed a violation. None showed commercial activity. None showed anything except a medical transport vehicle sitting exactly where it belonged. The hum of my laptop fan filled the silence. I leaned closer to the screen. A detail in the corner of one photo caught my eye. The timestamp had been cropped. Another image showed a shadow angle that did not match the date listed beneath it. Small details. Important details. I opened the files side by side. The inconsistencies multiplied. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was Kevin. I answered immediately. He had been reviewing the packet too. His voice sounded sharper than usual. He pointed out that one of the photographs appeared to have been taken during a week when my van was at a repair facility 40 miles away. I checked my records. He was right. I still had the repair invoice. That image could not have been taken when they claimed. A knot formed in my stomach. Somebody had either made a mistake or hoped nobody would look closely. Neither possibility helped them. The clock on the microwave showed 10:23. Outside, a dog barked somewhere down the street. Porch lights glowed through the darkness. Everything looked normal beyond my windows. Inside, the story was changing shape. This was no longer about one toe. I printed several pages and spread them across the table. The smell of warm paper drifted from the printer. I highlighted dates, circled names, drew lines between events. The timeline grew more troubling. Several documents referenced board discussions that supposedly happened before complaints were ever filed. Other notices contained identical wording despite being issued months apart. The language looked copied and pasted. Around 11 o'clock, another email arrived. This one came from a resident I barely knew. His name was Mark Jensen. He apologized for contacting me so late, but said he had heard what happened. Attached were screenshots from a community forum that had been deleted months earlier. I opened them carefully. My pulse quickened. Diane had participated in the discussion. So had Brian. They openly discussed finding ways to remove certain vehicles from public view. My vehicle was not named directly, but the descriptions were specific enough to recognize. The comments stopped abruptly after several replies warned them about discrimination concerns. Then the entire thread disappeared. At least, that was what everyone thought. Mark had saved copies. I stared at the screenshots for a long moment. The refrigerator clicked on behind me. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled softly across the night sky. More pieces were falling into place. Not enough to understand everything. Enough to see a pattern. Shortly before midnight, I received another message. This one came from the older man I had met at the towing yard. He asked if I could meet him the following morning. According to his message, he had served on an HOA committee years earlier. He claimed to possess records that never appeared in official archives. I read that sentence twice. Then I looked back at the growing stack of documents covering my table. The compliance hearing suddenly seemed much less important than whatever those missing records contained. The next morning could not come soon enough. The next morning arrived under a blanket of gray clouds. The air smelled like rain and fresh mulch from the landscaping crews working near the entrance monument. I barely slept. The documents remained spread across my dining room table exactly where I had left them. Coffee steamed beside a stack of printed emails as I reviewed everything one more time. At 8 sharp, I drove to a small diner on the edge of town using another rideshare service. The older man from the towing yard was already there. His name was Harold Bennett. He sat in a corner booth near the window with a worn leather briefcase resting beside him. The place smelled of bacon, coffee, and old wood. Harold looked around before speaking. His cautious manner immediately caught my attention. He did not waste time. He opened the briefcase and pulled out several folders. The paper inside looked old. Some pages carried faded letterheads from years earlier. Others contained meeting notes and archived communications. Harold slid one folder toward me. "These never made it into the official records," he said quietly. I opened the first file. Inside were minutes from HOA committee meetings dating back nearly 7 years. Names appeared throughout the pages. Diane's name appeared more than most. I flipped through carefully. Several entries described discussions about vehicle restrictions. Others focused on enforcement priorities. Then I found something unusual. One section mentioned avoiding broad enforcement because it would create resistance from influential homeowners. Instead, it recommended addressing issues individually. That wording stayed with me. Individually. Selectively. Another piece fit into place. Harold stirred his coffee slowly. He explained that he left the committee years ago after repeated disagreements about transparency. According to him, some decisions happened before meetings officially occurred. Other discussions never appeared in final records. His voice remained calm, but the disappointment was obvious. The rain finally started outside. Small droplets tapped against the diner windows. I continued reading. About halfway through the second folder, I found a familiar phrase. Community appearance threat. The exact wording Diane used against me. The document was 6 years old. Different resident. Same language. Same process. Same outcome. Harold watched my reaction. "You see it now," he said. I nodded. This was not an isolated event. It looked procedural, refined, repeated. Before leaving, Harold handed me a flash drive. He said it contained archived correspondence saved before certain records disappeared from committee servers. The weight of that tiny device felt disproportionate to its size. Back home, the rain had intensified. Water streamed down the windows while thunder rolled in the distance. I plugged the drive into my laptop and opened the files. Hundreds of emails appeared. Some were routine, others were not. I organized them by sender and date. Patterns emerged quickly. Certain residents received warnings. Others received exceptions. Similar situations produced very different outcomes. Then I noticed something else. Vehicles almost identical to mine had received approval letters in previous years. Some even remained parked within the neighborhood at that very moment. I opened satellite images, community directories, and archived newsletters. The evidence kept growing. Around noon, Kevin stopped by. Together we compared addresses. By the end of the hour, we identified 4 active vehicles that matched the same category Diane claimed violated standards. None had been cited. None had been towed. The rain eased outside. Sunlight pushed through the clouds in narrow beams. For the first time, the issue looked larger than a disagreement about one vehicle. The numbers told a different story. Someone had been choosing who received enforcement and who did not. Then Kevin pointed at a name buried deep inside one of the archived email chains. Kevin tapped the screen with his finger. The name buried inside the archived email chain belonged to a property manager who no longer worked with the HOA. I opened the message and leaned closer. Rainwater still dripped from the roof outside, creating a steady rhythm against the patio stones. The email itself looked ordinary at first. Then I noticed the date. It had been sent less than 2 weeks before Diane first joined the board leadership team years ago. The subject line referenced enforcement consistency. The contents said the exact opposite. The former manager warned that selective enforcement created legal exposure and community distrust. He specifically recommended applying vehicle rules equally to every resident. A reply appeared beneath it. Diane's name was attached. Her response was brief. She argued that certain situations required discretion. That word appeared again. Discretion. I had seen it 3 times already in different records. Kevin sat back in his chair. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The house was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioner and the occasional roll of distant thunder. Then another detail surfaced. The same email chain contained a spreadsheet attachment. We opened it immediately. Rows of addresses filled the screen. Violation categories appeared beside each property. Some addresses showed repeated warnings. Others showed none. My eyes moved down the page slowly. The numbers told a story no meeting minutes ever could. Similar situations produced completely different outcomes. Certain residents received reminders. Others received fines. A few received immediate enforcement actions. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Kevin rubbed his forehead. This looks deliberate. I nodded. It did. Around 3 in the afternoon, my phone rang. The caller identification showed the HOA office. I answered. The receptionist informed me that additional documents had been added to my hearing packet. Her tone sounded rehearsed. Professional. Careful. I thanked her and ended the call. A new email arrived less than a minute later. I opened it immediately. The attachment contained several witness statements. According to the documents, multiple residents had complained about my vehicle for months. That claim surprised me. Not because complaints were impossible, because I recognized some of the names. One belonged to a neighbor who had personally supported me the previous day. Another belonged to a resident who had moved away 6 months earlier. I called the first neighbor directly. He answered after 2 rings. When I asked about the statement, confusion filled his voice. He insisted he had never submitted any complaint. Not once. I emailed him a copy. A long silence followed while he reviewed it. Then he exhaled sharply. The signature looked similar to his. Similar was not the same. Another crack appeared in the foundation. Late that afternoon, I organized every document into separate folders. Emails, notices, photos, statements, meeting records, tow paperwork. The dining room table disappeared beneath stacks of evidence. Sunlight finally broke through the clouds outside. Bright beams reflected across the polished wood surface. For a moment, the room looked less like a home and more like an investigation office. The compliance hearing was only days away now. Diane seemed determined to accelerate everything. That alone raised questions. Most organizations move slowly. This one seemed to be sprinting. Around sunset, another message arrived from Harold. Attached was a scanned document he had overlooked earlier. I opened it while standing near the kitchen window. Cars moved quietly through the neighborhood outside. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalk. The normal scene contrasted sharply with the page glowing on my screen. At the bottom of the document sat a recommendation written years ago. It advised board members to avoid actions affecting residents who relied on specialized transportation. Then I saw who signed the recommendation. Diane herself. For several seconds, I simply stared at Diane's signature. Evening sunlight stretched across the kitchen floor in long golden bands. Outside, a basketball bounced somewhere down the street. A dog barked twice, and then everything went quiet again. The recommendation on my screen was clear. Years earlier, Diane herself had supported protections for residents who depended on specialized transportation. The language was direct. It warned against actions that could interfere with access to medical services. Yet she had personally authorized the removal of my vehicle. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. I printed the document immediately. The printer hummed to life. Warm paper slid into the tray. Another piece joined the growing stack on my dining room table. The hearing packet sat nearby. Every hour it looked weaker. Every new record seemed to raise more questions than answers. I called Harold. He answered on the second ring. When I described the document, he laughed softly. Not because it was funny, because he sounded unsurprised. According to him, Diane had changed positions several times over the years whenever it benefited board leadership. Consistency was not her strongest quality. Results were. That statement stayed with me long after the call ended. Around 7 that evening, Kevin arrived carrying a tablet computer. He looked excited. More excited than I had seen him all week. Without saying much, he placed the device on the table and opened a map application. Colored markers covered several streets throughout the neighborhood. Kevin had spent the afternoon documenting vehicles similar to mine. 4 became 6. 6 became 9. By sunset, he had identified 12 active vehicles that appeared to fall under the same category Diane claimed violated community standards. Some were parked in driveways. Others sat alongside yards. None had active citations. None had pending hearings. The evidence no longer suggested inconsistency. It suggested selectivity. We compared addresses against archived enforcement records. The results grew even stranger. Several residents had received exemptions. Others had received courtesy notices. One had received nothing despite repeated complaints from neighbors. My case stood alone. The room felt smaller as the realization settled in. Rain tapped lightly against the windows again. The weather had shifted back and forth all week, matching the uncertainty surrounding the case. I leaned back in my chair, and looked across the stacks of documents. Every path seemed to lead toward the same conclusion. The enforcement action was not random. The next morning brought another surprise. A certified letter arrived from the HOA attorney. The envelope rested in my mailbox beneath a layer of damp morning mist. I carried it inside and opened it carefully. The attorney requested additional information regarding my transportation needs. The timing felt unusual. The hearing was approaching rapidly. Why ask now? Why not before the vehicle was removed? The questions multiplied. I read the letter twice. Then I noticed a sentence near the bottom. The attorney specifically requested copies of medical transport registration records and accommodation documentation. That request changed the equation. Up to that point, most communications came from Diane and board representatives. Now legal counsel appeared interested. Somebody was reviewing facts more closely. Somebody was asking questions. I scanned the letter and forwarded it to Kevin. And Harold. Less than 20 minutes later, Kevin called. His voice carried a level of urgency I had not heard before. He had found another archived email. This one involved communication between board leadership and legal counsel several years earlier. The topic sounded familiar. Specialized transportation, accommodation requests, protected access concerns. My pulse quickened as he described it. The board had previously received guidance warning them to proceed carefully in situations involving medical transportation. They had been told to seek review before taking action. I looked at the empty spot in my driveway through the kitchen window. The morning sun had finally broken through the clouds. Light reflected off the wet pavement where my vehicle should have been. Then another email notification appeared on my phone. The new email came from a sender I did not recognize. I opened it cautiously. Morning sunlight filled the kitchen, reflecting off the stacks of documents covering nearly every available surface. The message contained only 2 sentences and 1 attachment. The sender claimed to be a former administrative assistant who had worked with the HOA management company several years earlier. Attached was a scanned internal memorandum. My pulse quickened as the file loaded. The document carried an old company logo and a chain of internal approvals. Near the middle of the page, one paragraph stood out immediately. It warned board members against taking actions that could interfere with transportation linked to medical necessity without first obtaining legal review. The language matched several records Kevin had uncovered. This was no longer one recommendation. It was becoming a repeated warning. I printed the memo and added it to the growing evidence file. The stack now looked more like a legal archive than a homeowner dispute. A few minutes later, my phone rang. It was the HOA attorney's office. The attorney himself came on the line. His voice sounded measured, careful, professional. He asked whether I intended to provide the requested documentation before the hearing. I told him I would. Then I asked a simple question. Had he personally reviewed the towing authorization? A brief silence followed. Not long, just enough to notice. He answered that he was still gathering information. That response revealed more than he intended. The conversation ended politely, but something had changed. For the first time, it felt as though questions were being asked on both sides. Around noon, Kevin arrived carrying a folder and 2 coffees. The smell of roasted coffee filled the room. He looked tired, excited too. During the night, he had reviewed dozens of archived community newsletters and public board updates. One detail kept appearing. Diane frequently promoted consistency and fairness as leadership priorities. The statements were everywhere. Newsletters, meeting summaries, candidate profiles, public comments. The contrast between those statements and the records on my table became impossible to ignore. We spent the next several hours organizing everything chronologically. The timeline stretched across the dining room. Email chains, internal memoranda, archive policies, witness statements, hearing notices, tow records. The more organized it became, the clearer the pattern appeared. Certain warnings were repeated for years, yet the actions taken against me ignored every one of them. Outside, the neighborhood carried on as normal. Lawn mowers buzzed in the distance. Delivery trucks moved through the subdivision. Children rode bicycles beneath bright blue skies. Meanwhile, inside my house, a completely different story was unfolding. Mid-afternoon brought another surprise. Harold called. He sounded more serious than usual. He had located someone who previously worked with the HOA management company during Diane's early years on the board. According to him, That individual remembered a controversial discussion involving accommodation requests and specialized transportation. The former employee was willing to speak. Not publicly, not yet, but privately. We arranged a meeting for the following day. After the call ended, I sat quietly for a moment. The air conditioner hummed overhead. A beam of sunlight illuminated the empty space where my vehicle normally sat outside. Every lead seemed connected now. Every document pointed toward the same question. Why had Diane ignored guidance she once supported? Why had the board ignored legal warnings repeated over multiple years? The hearing was approaching quickly, yet something else began to concern me. The closer we got, the more inconsistencies appeared in the HOA records themselves. Near sunset, another email arrived from the board. This one amended portions of the hearing packet. Several statements had been revised. Certain dates had changed. Entire paragraphs had disappeared. I compared the new version with the original. The edits were significant. Somebody was rewriting the story. Then I noticed one correction that changed everything. The correction sat halfway down the revised hearing packet. At first glance it looked minor. A single sentence had been removed. Yet that sentence had originally stated that multiple resident complaints triggered the enforcement action. In the new version, that claim was gone entirely. I compared both documents side by side beneath the dining room light. The difference was undeniable. Someone had quietly eliminated the very justification they previously relied upon. The room felt still. Even the air conditioner had stopped running. I looked out the window toward the empty spot in my driveway. The silence carried more weight than any argument. If the complaints were no longer part of the story, what remained? The next morning arrived bright and unusually cool. Sunlight reflected off puddles left by the previous night's rain. I met Harold at a small office building on the far side of town. The former management employee was waiting in a conference room near the back. Her name was Linda. She looked nervous from the moment she sat down. A paper cup of coffee rested untouched beside her. The room smelled faintly of copier toner and carpet cleaner. For several minutes, she spoke carefully. Then, little by little, more details emerged. According to Linda, years earlier, the management company repeatedly advised the board to avoid aggressive actions involving accommodation requests or specialized transportation. Those conversations were documented. Training materials existed. Internal guidance existed. Legal reviews existed. None of that surprised me anymore. What surprised me was the next part. Linda remembered a meeting where board members discussed whether certain residents received different treatment than others. The discussion became heated. Several people objected. Some records were revised afterward. Others disappeared from official meeting summaries altogether. Harold exchanged a glance with me. Nobody interrupted her. Linda continued. She explained that the management company often worried less about actual violations and more about inconsistent enforcement. Consistency protected organizations. Selectivity created risk. Her words echoed the same warning I had seen repeated across years of records. Different people. Same concern. Before leaving, Linda handed me copies of several archived training documents she had retained after retirement. Most were routine. One was not. A section highlighted the importance of reviewing actions that could affect transportation connected to medical needs. The language was remarkably direct. It specifically recommended consultation before enforcement. Consultation, review, documentation. Every safeguard seemed to point in the same direction. Yet none appeared to have happened in my case. The drive home felt different. Traffic moved slowly beneath a clear blue sky. My phone sat on the passenger seat beside a growing stack of folders. At a red light, I glanced at a family crossing the street. Ordinary people living ordinary lives. The simplicity of that moment stood in sharp contrast to the complexity now surrounding my situation. By mid-afternoon, Kevin arrived again. We reviewed everything Linda provided. The timeline stretched across nearly half the dining room floor. Documents overlapped. Notes covered the margins. Colored tabs marked key events. Then Kevin noticed something neither of us had seen before. A name appeared repeatedly throughout the older records. Not Diane. Not Brian. A legal consultant. The consultant had reviewed several accommodation-related issues years earlier and provided written recommendations. Multiple board members acknowledged receiving those recommendations. Diane's name appeared among them. That discovery mattered. Knowledge changes responsibility. We both understood that immediately. Evenings settled over the neighborhood. Porch lights flickered on. A warm breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass through the open kitchen window. My phone buzzed just after sunset. The screen displayed a name I had not called in months. I stared at it for several seconds before answering. The caller was my cousin Nathan. He rarely called without a reason. His first question caught me completely off guard. My cousin Nathan did not start with a greeting. His voice came through the phone calm and direct. "Why is your HOA attorney asking questions about transportation records?" For a second I said nothing. The evening breeze drifted through the open kitchen window. Crickets chirped outside. Kevin looked up from the dining room table as soon as he saw my expression change. I asked Nathan what he meant. He explained that a colleague had mentioned a community dispute involving accommodation concerns and unusual enforcement actions. The details sounded familiar because they were mine. Nathan rarely involved himself in neighborhood disagreements. He had spent years building a reputation for staying far away from local politics. That was exactly why his call mattered. I walked onto the back patio while he spoke. The sky glowed orange beyond the trees. He listened carefully as I summarized everything that had happened. The towing, the hearing, the contradictory records, the missing complaints, the revised statements, the old guidance documents. I expected surprise. Instead, silence followed. Then Nathan asked one question. "Do you have proof they knew about the transportation issue before the removal?" I looked back through the kitchen window toward the stacks of documents. The answer came immediately. Yes. More than one document suggested exactly that. Nathan told me to preserve every record exactly as it existed. No alterations. No annotations on originals. No assumptions. Just organization and documentation. His tone remained neutral, but I could hear growing concern beneath it. After the call ended, Kevin raised an eyebrow. I filled him in. Neither of us spoke for several moments. The significance settled slowly. For days we had been collecting pieces. Now those pieces were beginning to form a complete picture. The next morning arrived clear and bright. Sunlight spilled across the dining room floor. The hearing was less than 48 hours away. My house looked more like an archive center than a residence. Folders lined the walls. Evidence packets sat stacked in neat rows. Every document had been indexed. Every timeline verified. Around 10 o'clock, another certified envelope arrived. This one came directly from the HOA board. I opened it carefully. The letter announced additional modifications to the hearing materials. Again, that made 3 revisions in less than a week. Kevin immediately compared the newest version against earlier copies. The differences were not cosmetic. References disappeared. Dates shifted. Explanations changed. Most striking of all, language suggesting resident complaints had almost completely vanished. The justification now focused on appearance standards alone. I stared at the pages. The story kept changing. Facts do not usually require that much revision. Around lunchtime, Harold arrived carrying another box of archived records. Dust covered the edges. The cardboard smelled old. Together we reviewed the contents. Most documents concerned routine community business. Budget reports. Landscaping contracts. Vendor agreements. Then Harold found a folder marked legal review correspondence. He opened it slowly. Several letters sat inside. One immediately caught my attention. The document discussed liability concerns involving transportation access. Certain paragraphs were highlighted in yellow marker. Someone years ago had considered the issue important enough to emphasize. We read every line carefully. The recommendations were consistent with everything else we had uncovered. Seek review. Verify facts. Avoid unnecessary interference. Document decision-making. The same themes appeared again and again. By mid-afternoon, rain clouds gathered over the neighborhood. Shadows darkened the windows. Thunder rumbled far away. My phone buzzed with a new email notification. It came from the HOA attorney. Attached was a short message requesting a private conversation before the hearing. Kevin looked at me. Harold looked at me. Nobody spoke. The request itself was unusual. The timing was even more unusual. I opened the email and read it twice. The attorney stated he wanted clarification regarding several newly discovered records. Newly discovered. Those 2 words echoed through my mind. Outside, the first drops of rain began striking the driveway. Inside, every piece of evidence suddenly seemed more important than ever. Then I noticed the final sentence at the bottom of the message. The final sentence at the bottom of the attorney's email stopped me cold. He wrote that several documents recently brought to his attention appeared inconsistent with representations previously provided to legal counsel. I read the line again while rain tapped steadily against the windows. Kevin leaned over my shoulder. Harold adjusted his glasses and read it himself. Nobody said anything for a few seconds. The words spoke loudly enough on their own. If legal counsel had received inaccurate information, the entire situation changed. Outside, thunder rolled across the neighborhood. Inside, the atmosphere felt equally charged. I replied and agreed to the conversation. The attorney called less than an hour later. His tone remained professional, measured, careful, yet something was different. He spent most of the call asking questions rather than making statements. He asked about the vehicle classification. He asked about the accommodation records. He asked about the hearing packet revisions. Most importantly, he asked when I first received notice of the enforcement action. I answered every question directly. The call lasted nearly 40 minutes. By the end, I noticed a pattern. He already knew many of the answers. He seemed to be confirming them. After the call ended, rain continued falling across the neighborhood. Water streamed down the glass doors, overlooking the patio. Kevin sat quietly reviewing notes. Harold organized documents into separate folders. The hearing was scheduled for the next evening. Yet the focus no longer seemed centered on me. More and more attention appeared directed toward how the decision had been made in the first place. The next morning arrived gray and cool. Low clouds hung over the subdivision. The empty space in my driveway greeted me again when I opened the front door. For a moment, I simply stood there. The absence remained impossible to ignore. Neighbors waved as they passed. Several stopped briefly to ask how things were going. Word had spread. People were paying attention now. Around 10 o'clock, another unexpected development occurred. Mrs. Callahan arrived carrying a small envelope. She explained that she had found it while sorting through old files. The envelope contained printed community emails from years earlier. Most were routine. One was not. Buried in the middle of a discussion about neighborhood policies sat a message from Diane herself. In that message, she argued that accommodation-related concerns should be reviewed individually and with caution. I stared at the page. Another contradiction. Another example of Diane advocating one standard in writing while apparently following another in practice. The stack of inconsistencies continued to grow. By afternoon, the dining room table could barely hold everything. Folders covered nearly every inch of available space. Timelines stretched from one end of the room to the other. Kevin had created comparison charts showing similar vehicles throughout the neighborhood. Harold had organized historical records. I added copies of every revised hearing packet. Looking at everything together created a powerful picture. Not because of any single document, because all of them pointed in the same direction. Late in the day, my cousin Nathan called again. His voice remained calm as always. He asked whether the hearing materials continued changing. When I told him they had been revised multiple times, he became very quiet. Then he reminded me of something simple. Credibility matters. Consistency matters. Documentation matters. Those words stayed with me after the call ended. Evening arrived. The rain finally stopped. Clouds parted enough for streaks of orange sunlight to break across the neighborhood. Cars lined the streets. Porch lights flickered on one by one. Everything looked peaceful. Yet beneath that calm surface, tension had been building for days. Around 7:30, a final email arrived from the HOA board. The message contained the agenda for the hearing. I opened it immediately. My eyes moved down the page. Then I stopped. A new item had been added near the very top. Legal counsel would be attending in person. That detail had never appeared in any previous notice. Kevin looked at me. Harold looked at me. The room fell silent once again. Tomorrow was no longer shaping up to be a routine compliance hearing. Something much bigger was about to happen. The hearing began at 6 o'clock sharp. The community clubhouse felt different the moment I walked inside. Bright overhead lights reflected off polished floors. The smell of coffee and fresh paper filled the room. Folding chairs lined the walls. Residents occupied nearly all of them. More people had shown up than anyone expected. Quiet conversations drifted through the air before fading whenever board members entered. Diane sat near the front beside Brian. Both appeared confident at first glance. Yet something seemed different. Neither spent much time speaking to the audience. Legal counsel sat several seats away reviewing a thick binder. That detail alone changed the atmosphere. This no longer felt like a routine enforcement meeting. It felt like scrutiny. I took my seat and placed several organized folders on the table in front of me. Kevin sat nearby. Harold occupied a chair along the wall. Mrs. Callahan appeared 3 rows back. Even neighbors who normally avoided community politics had come. The room carried the tension of a storm waiting to break. The board president opened the session with standard procedures. His voice sounded steady, professional. Then the discussion moved directly to my case. Diane spoke first. She described appearance concerns, community standards, enforcement obligations. I listened quietly. The words sounded familiar because I had read versions of them for days. Yet something immediately stood out. The explanation no longer matched earlier documents. Several details had changed again. Legal counsel looked down at his notes while she spoke. He did not interrupt. He did not react. He simply listened. When Diane finished, the board president invited questions. Legal counsel spoke before anyone else. The room became silent instantly. His first question concerned notification procedures. Diane answered. His second question concerned complaint records. Brian answered. Then came the third question. He asked when accommodation information first became known to the board. Diane hesitated. Only briefly. Most people probably missed it. I did not. Neither did Kevin. The attorney wrote something in his binder. Another question followed. Then another. None sounded dramatic. Each sounded precise. Dates, emails, timelines, reviews, procedures. The details we had spent days documenting suddenly became the center of the conversation. Residents exchanged glances. Chairs creaked softly. Rain tapped against the clubhouse windows outside. Diane's confidence seemed to fade a little more with every answer. Then legal counsel referenced one of the revised hearing packets. He asked why multiple versions existed. Silence followed. The board president adjusted papers in front of him. Brian shifted in his seat. Nobody answered immediately. The attorney waited. Finally, an explanation came. Administrative corrections. Formatting updates. Clarifications. The response sounded reasonable until he placed 2 versions side by side and pointed to entire sections that had disappeared. The room grew even quieter. I could hear the faint buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. For the first time all evening, Diane looked genuinely uncomfortable. The discussion continued for nearly an hour. Every few minutes another document surfaced. Archived emails, historical guidance, training materials, internal recommendations. None alone decided the issue. Together, they painted a picture that became increasingly difficult to ignore. Then legal counsel turned toward me. He asked whether I wished to provide additional records. I slid several folders across the table. Copies only. Organized chronologically. The attorney reviewed them carefully. 1 page. Then another. Then another. The room waited. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the subdivision. Finally, he reached the document bearing Diane's own signature supporting protections related to specialized transportation. He stopped reading, looked at the page again, then compared it with notes already inside his binder. A long silence settled across the clubhouse. Even the residents stopped whispering. Something important had connected. The attorney closed the binder slowly and looked toward the board president. What he said next changed the entire direction of the meeting. The attorney closed the binder slowly and looked toward the board president. The room remained completely silent. Rain continued tapping softly against the clubhouse windows. Then he spoke. His voice was calm, professional, yet every word seemed heavier than the last. He stated that the matter before the board could no longer be evaluated solely as a routine enforcement issue. Several records raised concerns about procedural consistency, documentation accuracy, and decision-making processes. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Diane stared at the table in front of her. Brian shifted uneasily in his chair. The board president cleared his throat, but said nothing. Legal counsel continued. He referenced the revised hearing packets, the missing complaint records, the archived guidance documents, the prior recommendations regarding specialized transportation. Most importantly, he noted that multiple facts presented throughout the process appeared inconsistent with records now available for review. A murmur spread through the audience. It lasted only a few seconds before fading again. The attorney then made a recommendation. He advised postponing any enforcement action pending further review. The room erupted into whispers. Residents exchanged looks across rows of folding chairs. Kevin leaned back slowly. Harold folded his arms. Mrs. Callahan smiled for the first time all evening. Diane finally spoke. Her voice sounded controlled, but the confidence from earlier was gone. She argued that the board had acted in good faith. She insisted appearance standards still mattered. Nobody disagreed. That was never the real issue. The question had become whether the standards were applied fairly and whether proper procedures had been followed. The difference mattered. The board president requested a brief recess. Members stepped away from the table and gathered near the far side of the room. Residents remained seated. Quiet conversations filled the clubhouse. The smell of coffee lingered in the air. Outside, the rain began to slow. I sat quietly and looked around the room. For days I had focused on documents, timelines, and evidence. Now I noticed something else. People looked relieved. Not because the matter was resolved. Because questions were finally being asked. 20 minutes later, the board returned. The president adjusted his microphone and read the decision. The enforcement action would be suspended immediately pending independent review. The compliance hearing would be continued to a later date. Additional records would be collected. Procedures would be examined. The room remained quiet for a moment. Then several residents nodded. Others exchanged relieved smiles. It was not a dramatic victory. It was something better. Process had returned. Facts mattered again. As the meeting ended, legal counsel approached me directly. He returned several copies of my documents and thanked me for organizing everything so thoroughly. His words were brief, professional, yet they carried weight. On my way out, I passed Diane near the entrance. For the first time since this began, she avoided eye contact. Neither of us spoke. Nothing needed to be said. Outside, the rain had stopped completely. The parking lot glistened beneath streetlights. Fresh air filled my lungs as I walked toward the curb. Kevin and Harold followed beside me. The tension that had lived in my shoulders for days finally eased. The next morning brought another development. The towing company contacted me. Arrangements had been made to release my vehicle without additional storage charges while the matter remained under review. By afternoon, it sat back in my driveway where it belonged. Sunlight reflected off the windshield. Neighbors waved as they passed. Children rode bicycles through the neighborhood. Life felt normal again. Yet one thing had changed permanently. Residents had started asking questions. Attendance at board meetings increased. Archived records were reviewed. Procedures became more transparent. Conversations happened openly instead of behind closed doors. Standing in my driveway that evening, I looked at the vehicle that had started everything. The issue was never really about transportation. It was about accountability. Systems only work when people believe the rules apply equally. The neighborhood understood that now. And judging by the conversations happening all around me, they were just getting started.